reflect about AI in enterprise. What are the potential opportunities, pitfalls, and what's the best way to avoid those pitfalls, and what's the path forward? Hopefully you are sufficiently caffeinated, and also looking forward to the session. This is going to be a light one. It's not going to go too deep into technicalities, but we'll try and keep it light and conversational. So let's get started. So when we talk about AI, we need to understand where we are within the industry, right? And we need to do that through the use of the timeline of last couple of years. So there are certain milestones that you all can relate to. So a lot started happening since the publication of Attention is All You Need paper, where we had the transformer architecture defined, which sufficiently led to exponential growth in the large language models, which led to the next event, which was essentially OpenAI's ChatGPT launch that happened in late 2022. And since then, we've seen unprecedented amount of activity across the industry. We've seen model grow a lot. We've seen a lot of investment. So let's see what all we saw over the last couple of years, which have been extremely eventful all throughout the industry, right? So the first thing that we saw was the model size and complexity grew quite significantly. We started with models that were 175 billion parameters to all the way to trillion parameters. I think we need to adjust the resolution slightly. No, the screen resolution, some part of the presentation is going out. The other thing that we saw was the global AI spending grew from somewhere close to 139 billion. It's closing somewhere close to $300 billion, right? The other thing that we saw since 2022, we have had as many as 70,000 new AI startups that have started across the world. And some of them were lucky enough to become unicorns. And as you know, unicorns by definition are the firms that generate close to $1 billion in valuation, right? Not revenue, valuation. So there have been many winners there. So we started, I think, with 119, 214 was the number for 2023, and I think we are somewhere close to 217, still two. So who were the winners in this particular AI race in the last couple of years? If you were to look at some of the winners, the winners were Cohere, AI21 Labs, OpenAI, of course, was the biggest winner. NVIDIA market capitalization has reached to $3 trillion, right? It's a third company after Apple and Microsoft. So obviously a lot of excitement, a lot of buzz and enthusiasm around AI, and trillions of money, millions of dollars are being poured into AI. But it's been 2 years now, almost close to 2 years since the launch of ChatGPT, which we can potentially call as the start of this particular era. And of late, what we've started to see since the mid of this year is people are now starting to question. So there's a uber cool VC firm by the name of Sequoia, and they came up with this AI $600 billion question, right? Goldman Sachs published a study where they're asking about the ROI problem of AI. Because what they've seen happen in the last 2 years is there's a significant amount of investment that has gone into AI with relatively low sort of return on that. So enterprises are concerned how best to make sure that the investments that they are putting into AI are yielding them the right results. So that's precisely what we're going to focus on. We'll try and take an enterprise lens today, not so much of a wider general industry lens. And what we'll do, essentially, I come from banking and financial services, so I'll take that as a lens for me, and I'll narrate what I've seen happen in the last couple of years. So if we look at the AI in enterprise, still need to adjust the resolution slightly. So if you look at the enterprise AI market, you'll see there are 3 sort of classes of adopters within the AI market. The very first class of adopter are people who are still sort of exploring the technology, so to speak, right? They are still conducting proof of concept, proof of value. They constitute roughly 38% of the market. The numbers come from the AI maturity index that was conducted very recently. Then there's a second class of people who have moved beyond POC, POV. Now they are talking about use cases that they are considering across the board, across the organization, and they roughly make 32%, but they've still not productionized them, right? And a very minute, small variety of 18% people, I think, have gone into production. They've started to integrate within them workflows, and they've started to see value come out of their AI investment, right? So what are the challenges that people within these three stratas of sort of adoption group are facing? Let's look at those challenges. And they all face unique challenges, right? Okay. It's not progressing. So essentially, while we work this out, the very first class of people, or the people who are exploring adoption, their concern is very traditional, right? We've seen with other trends as well. There's a perennial concern of organizational data safety that kind of restrict people from adopting a new technology. That happened with cloud as well. There's a concern around availability of resources, both in terms of operational resources and talent pool that they need to kind of bring the technology in. Many a times there's operational readiness, which is also a challenge, because when you talk to them, when you explain what are the benefit, the most of the time they are concerned how to bring the tech inside the organization, because obviously when you talk about large banks, they have their own processes to get the technology in. So they are also concerned around that. And the third and the most important thing that we have seen is there's no comprehensive AI and data strategy that they started to put together, which results in lack of quality data, which is the fuel for AI, right? If AI is the rocket ship, data is its fuel. So that's availability of that good quality data is very, very important, right? For the second group of people who started to adopt, what they'll see is there are different business units who started to run with multiple use cases. And typically what tends to happen, which happened with cloud, I'll keep comparing it with cloud as a trend, is there are different business units who are going off and doing their own sort of exploration. And at that point in time, you need to make sure that they are doing within the confines of the right policy framework, standards, and guidelines. And as a result, you need a common governance framework, which is very, very important. They're also trying to understand how best to integrate AI within these workflows. They're also concerned around doing model selection, validation, fine-tuning, so on and so forth. And people within the last and the most mature group are typically dealing with the problems of model lifecycle management, and essentially challenges of scaling it across the enterprise, which they are sort of concerned about. So through the presentation today, I'll try and touch on some of these challenges and discuss how we've seen them solved across our partners and enterprises. So if you were to imagine a large IT enterprise, kept at a very simplistic pizza diagram, right? So if you look at the AI enterprise IT estate, the industry that I come from is usually across these four categories. You've got retail banking, you've got commercial investment banking, payments, and retail, right? Private banking. So when you talk about these four business units, the concentric circles that you see on the diagram represent the core, supporting services, and corporate services, right? So the core systems are the ones. So for example, if you understand retail banking, I'm talking about core banking system, KYC, onboarding. If you come from investment banking, I'm talking about front, middle, and back office capabilities, custody, and fund administration. Supporting services are essentially the downstream systems that help complete the service flow. And then corporate services make up the HR, CRM, so on and so forth, that complete the rest of the periphery of the IT ecosystem, right? So just by show of hands, how many of you who are currently in the enterprises, another category across which we divide applications, right? And that's in-house application versus your vendor application or SaaS solution. What would you say is the right mix between in-house, or optimal mix between in-house versus a vendor solution? How many of you would say, is it 70 in-house, 30 vendor services? 70-30? Yeah, some people agree. right? 80-20? 80-20? Should I go down? 60-40? Is that what you're seeing in your organization, folks? And should I be controversial and say 50-50? How many of you are seeing 50-50? Okay, some people are there. Brilliant. So, if we were to look at this pizza diagram and kind of put some toppings on there, if the green topping represents the in-house systems, and the blue topping represent the vendor system or SaaS solution, this is roughly your sort of IT estate split across these two categories, right? And if you were to bring it to life for banking, these are the systems that you would typically see in a banking IT ecosystem. Now, let me put a fact to you, right? What we saw during the cloud revolution, there were many banks who were trying to, or many enterprises who were trying to adopt cloud. They were in different horizons of adoption. They were trying to get there. But over a period of time, they were using 30 or more than 30% of their IT estate was vendor application. And what they saw started happening is the newer version of their vendor softwares started becoming either a cloud hosted solution or a SaaS only solutions. So they were gently nudged into adopting cloud, right? What will happen in case of AI? So if you are not a leader in AI adoption, what would happen, right? So I put it to you that because of the market forces, all the vendor software companies or the product companies will start introducing AI or have already started introducing AI as part of the feature within their product portfolio. And as a result, you would have a significant penetration of AI across your enterprise, right? Think about that for a minute. There is ramification, there are consequences to this particular event happening, right? When you talk about AI governance, EU AI Act defines multiple roles for different sort of categories of people who are involved in the entire value chain. There are some people who are called AI source companies, and the people who implement AI are called deployers of AI solutions. And deployers of AI solution also has certain policy and regulatory obligation in the EU AI Act. And by choosing to use AI within your software solution space, you would essentially become a deployer. You would be liable to sort of start looking at those requirements very, very carefully. So that's the reason it's very, very important for you to think through your policy and governance framework very, very carefully. Moving on. So when we talk about enterprise AI, people are always saying it's very, very important for you to start integrating AI in your enterprise. But when you talk about integrating AI, what exactly we mean, right? So let's try and understand that. We are essentially talking about looking at your day-to-day IT process and workflows and try and think about how AI can essentially add value there, right? And which workflows should you choose, right? What's the right answer? Which workflows should be chosen for this particular one? The ones that deliver most bang for your buck at the end of the day, isn't it? So most of the time when we think about AI, we always go to, outlandish case studies for new business revenue streams. You should do that, but there are certain things which are certainly in your control coming from an IT organization. You are an IT part of a bank or an enterprise. So what is it that you are doing? So if we look at this entire IT landscape, again, essentially we are talking about a system, right? It constitutes of multiple systems. And if you look at the system itself, only 10% of that system's entire lifespan is in design, development, and subsequently towards the end of the life, it's in replacement or demise, right? 90% of a system's life cycle is spent in application enhancement and maintenance, isn't it? So the amount of money that your enterprise spends on application maintenance is huge, right? And your run the business, change the business budget is reflective of that. So if you look at your run the business, change the business budget, almost 70% of your IT budget goes to run the business versus only 30% of it in change the business, right? You may have some variations of this here and there, depending on the phase your organization is in, whether you are in growth phase or so on and so forth. But most of the organization, that's the split. And within that RTB budget, the 40% of your RTB budget is dedicated to application maintenance and enhancement. Rest of it goes into software licenses, infrastructure, so on and so forth. So when you have this kind of a budget split, what are we spending the money on? We are spending the money on sourcing, staffing, training, resources who are managing your complex ecosystem of applications. And it takes a lot of time for people to be hired, trained, understand the entire complex ecosystem, and then start resolving your L1, L2, L3 support tickets. And by the time they understand all of the systems, they get a better offer or whatever, and they move on, right? And you have to rinse and repeat the entire process over and over again. How do we make sure that that entire process is optimal? So we started working with one of our clients. It's a Swiss multinational bank, and we put a challenge to ourselves. Is it possible for us to have them commit code on day one? Now, there are two aspects to having them commit code on day one. The first aspect is operational readability of keeping the infrastructure, laptop, source code configuration, CI/CD pipeline, everything set up for them so that they are technically able to do that. The second part was essentially making sure that you have the right knowledge and skill to commit code, right? Not commit code to production, but at least put it in integration, get it tested. So what we did with AI integrated in that SRE workflow, we started looking at the knowledge base that we are working with. What are the knowledge bases that we have within the enterprise? We have CMDB, ServiceNow. We have Jira, which is your ticketing system. We have Stack Overflow that contains the issue log, right? We have the GitLab repository which contains the source code samples. So for a certain group of applications, for a certain service line, we started taking a dump of that, created a knowledge base on top of it, and we created a conversational interface on top where a guy who joins on day one can potentially post a challenge, a ticket number, or an error code in that chat window and can get the resolution. So at least even if you can have him deal with the recurring issues, you still save a huge amount of cost, right? So we are already seeing a 5% uptick. So if you were to run some numbers, just hypothetically, if your organization's IT budget is $1 billion, 70-30 split, 700-300, 40% of 700 is 280, that's roughly equivalent to your CTB budget. So if you deliver 5% saving on your CTB, you essentially can negotiate improvement in your CTB budget, which is what all IT managers want at the end of the day, right? So this is how you see your AI improving value, bringing value to your own sort of backyard, so to speak. Then there are other use cases that you can consider, contemplate as well, right? Moving on to the next one, how should you then spend your CTB AI budget? What should be the focus of your CTB AI budget? The first thing that you need to do is identify and rapidly build use cases. You need to then understand how can you start adopting by training people up, building scalable AI platforms, and finally you need to put a governance structure in place which essentially looks at all the regulations, right? So let's get to all of these one by one. Identifying and building use cases is the most important step, if not the ultimate thing. You need to start understanding the business pain point and opportunities. The way to do it is you need to start brainstorming within your own business units and divisions to try and understand, sit down with your business users, what are the pain points that they are facing, what are the opportunities, write them down, do design thinking workshop with your stakeholders to essentially then come up with capability versus the use case mapping, right? You need to be absolutely clear about the outcomes that you are trying to drive, define clear KPIs against each of those use cases, and ensure that you create a proper business case that you take to your benefits review board and then vet it through before you even start touching code, right? The third thing is, of course, ensuring the data availability and quality is there so use cases start giving the right value. And you need to be absolutely brutal when it comes to when you start iterating through your POC process and you see that your KPIs are not trending in the right direction despite number of iteration, you should have the ability to kill it and then take up the next use case. It's absolutely critical that you do that. And finally, you conduct your basically value and pivot, right? So piloting is very, very important. Once you start proving the value, you need to start understanding what's that narrow lane of sort of a wider use case that I can go with so that I can prove value to business and then expand. Many a times people are struggling to do POC, POE because they are very sure, should we go for a SaaS model? Should we use a sandbox? The best thing that they can do is, there are a number of service providers who started to offer sandbox where you can easily do a use case experiment, right? What are the types of use cases? So we can roughly divide them into three broad categories. The first category is the business growth. An example is we have a Synchron Amplify use case where for an investment bank, a big part of their entire function is they do market research, right? So you would typically have someone conduct a detailed analysis, stock analysis, and it would typically take them about 1 or 2 weeks to study the fundamentals, understand the stock price patterns, so on and so forth. And then they would present all of this to their senior trader for them to decide to take a position on that stock or so on and so forth. Now, with the help of this Gen AI power tool, what we are doing is we are looking at all the public sources as well as paid sources like Bloomberg, Telecool, so on and so forth, and we are able to generate a stock analysis within minutes, right? So that's a huge value add that we've seen come through. The second category is operational efficiency. We started to use HR chatbots, which are probably a very common use case that we've seen across the industry. What we have done is we have fed all the organizational policies and other documents to this particular chatbot, and the amount of time that we have saved in the tickets that were raised to HR for different queries, different SOPs, has gone down significantly. The third is the developer productivity. I think the previous speaker covered it in great detail, so I don't need to go there. But what are the other use cases that we started to see? So obviously chatbot we talked about. The other area where people have started to use AI in a big way is contact center management. Because that is one area where you need to process huge amount of conversational data, and traditionally you would have a call center executive reporting into a manager, and then there'll be a hierarchy of people who would essentially always watch out for these chats for non-compliance, misleading communication, actions that were followed or so on and so forth, which can fit very well with the case study of generative AI, where it can summarize the action that has taken place, the commitment to action. If there were any non-compliance, it can suggest training, and if there were any other issues, it can also sort of resolve them. The other area that we've seen is DX, developer experience, customer experience, onboarding, hiring, performance management, so on and so forth, right? There's a very useful, very interesting case study for Leadership Insight, but I'll probably won't go in there. You can contact me later on if you are interested to understand more about it. So once you these are the use cases that we are seeing both with our partners and across the industry. Now training, when we talk about AI training, people typically are too obsessed with only training the technical workforce, right? That's a mistake, right? So you need to consider the full 360-degree set of stakeholders that you are catering within the organization. So because going forward, you will see a new sort of breed of developers or engineers evolving, and I'll probably talk about that. So when we talk about a 360-degree empowerment, what we are talking about is a very focused persona-based training that caters to individual personas. So the first persona, of course, is AI engineers. These guys are experts in machine learning and artificial intelligence, and these are the people who are going to design your AI systems and platforms. Then there is a second category that we all probably fall into, is AI-powered engineer. So these are your normal software engineers who are equipped with the knowledge of prompt engineering, have started to use Copilot, Code Whisperer, and these technologies to start designing your application rapidly, right? And the third category is the AI-enabled business user. Now this is the ignored category that I was talking about. what we've seen happen within our own enterprise and across our client and partner organizations is when you start designing these AI-based systems. So what we have done is we have created an organizational chat system, we have created a developer portal, we have created a number of other tools. This group of people who were traditionally only focused with business application usage have started to see their productivity shoot through the roof. Because now, for example, for a marketing team who are trying to create a marketing campaign, they can use a chat tool to create a very focused account-based marketing campaign. For a finance guy who's trying to engage a lawyer to understand a certain nuance of a legal framework in US can probe that very easily. Someone who sits within a PMO function wants to query a SOW, right? To understand what it says in my contract. With AI, you have a conversational interface. You can talk to that doc rather than having to go through that 100-page long legal document, right? And there are so many cases. I can go on and on. Our recruitment team is using it very effectively. We operate across 50 geographies. So we have to hire in France. We have to hire in Bulgaria. And for those geographies, you need to publish job description in that language. We need to interview candidate in that language. We need to bring them in, right? So how do we quickly create a job description for a certain profile, convert into the language that you need? How do you then hire person against that? That entire process can be streamlined significantly with AI. And we've seen that happen with AI-enabled business users. My sort of prediction in the next couple of years is there'll be a counterclockwise momentum that's going to happen from AI-enabled business users, AI-powered engineers, and AI engineers. There'll be a blurry new category that's going to be created because of prompt engineering, it's a level playing field now. I'm seeing really interesting trends within the industry, which is going to project this momentum. A person who's probably 5, 8, 10 years trained on Java can still now, we've run multiple hackathons within our own organization. They are competing with college grads who are very good at prompt engineering, right? And the last category is, of course, the most important one. We need to make sure that our end users and customers are AI aware. They understand the way in which we have started to integrate AI in our own business processes. We are fully transparent about how we are using their data, how we are essentially using AI to bring power to them, and then how are we using it to hyper-personalize their engagement with our business, right? And that transparency will bring trust, which what every organization essentially wants at the end of the day. So for example, if you are looking to send, every now and then we get lengthy communication coming to our inbox in form of there's an update to my terms and condition, right? And nobody bothers to read the terms and condition update, and they know that, right? So why can't you use AI to send a voice file which tells you what that update is, right? What can you do more creatively to engage with your customer to build that trust and confidence? Now and then, I don't want to name companies, but I get terms and condition update every single time I'm trying to use something. And you don't have the patience or time to go through and actually read what was updated actually. Did they change it over? We're going to now start using all of your data sort of thing. So that's very, very important, okay? So moving on to the next one. I will not probably go through all parts of this entire slide, but what we are trying to paint a picture of is what does Gen AI, what are the sort of non-exhaustive list of Gen AI sort of life cycle, right? And we don't necessarily need to go left to right, because essentially what I'm talking about is a broad stroke, what are the components that we see we will need over the next couple of years if you want to develop serious, mature LLM applications. So obviously, the previous speaker spoke about their capabilities. A number of platforms that are offering models for specific purposes, right? So we've already seen through Hugging Face and other platforms, there are different models that are available for different purposes. What will start happening, has already started happening, is there'll be very specialized marketplace for models. So for example, if I'm a retail banking client dealing with certain type of KYC or not, there will be a model for that, right? So you can start, thinking about plugging and playing these models across your IT ecosystem. So that's definitely going to happen. What you need to do is prep, tune, and evolve those models, adopt those models, and essentially start to think about how you're going to serve those models out. And in the next slide, I'll probably also explain how do we see that happening. But the best way, in my opinion, is you expose them through APIs, and you ensure that they are grounded. So the previous guy talked about grounding is essentially making sure that your AI's output are properly vetted. So the Vertex AI offers grounding support where you can actually do a search for citation and ensure that the outputs that are coming are right. The enterprise integration also is very, very important. So if you come left to right, usually the UX, you may or you may not use UX for your LLM-based systems, but if there are there, it would be a good if he has a lightweight sort of a touch with search capability and chat. Prompt, again, is a big topic, but there are a number of different techniques like chain of thought, tree of thought, X of thought, so to speak, and there are React frameworks, DSPY, so on and so forth. I won't probably get into it, but you then complement it with RAG, which essentially offers you context building and improves your input, which essentially gives you better output for your own systems. This layer is very important, governance layer. So what you need to do, when I talk about governance, I'll come to different components that we need to be careful about. The most important bit here is to ensure that you have right degree of transparency into your decision-making process of the model. And there are a number of tools that are sort of started to kind of offer that. It's not still very mature, so there's a lot that can be done. And once the data comes out of that, we need to make sure that it's properly content moderated, right? And it caters to that particular persona within your organization, going in and coming out both ways, right? You shouldn't inadvertently expose data to a user group that's not supposed to access that data. And then finally, we need to make sure that they are all sort of come together. So if you were to kind of imagine this entire stack into the enterprise, to scale it up, we need to think about a capability model, right? And what typically tends to happen when you talk about within an enterprise creating a horizontal capability, it immediately becomes a bottleneck and it creates a lot of issues. So for those of you who probably have been through that cloud adoption journey within your own enterprise, there was a team that was responsible for creating landing zone, right? And then everybody kind of kept waiting for them to create landing zone component. And oh, I can't really go to cloud because these guys have not created the right landing zone for me. So that's the fate that ultimately all large horizontal functions meet. So it's very important that whenever you're trying to define a cross-organizational structure, it has to be very lean, and it has to only play to ensuring the leanest possible structure discipline that's required. So in terms of capability layers, what we advise is you keep a 3-layered capability model. The first thing that you need to do, especially it's also quite challenging because when you talk about different business units, all different business units operate across different geographies. And when you talk about data, data is a very sticky component, right? So if you are operating across China, they have their own data residency and localization laws. You can't have that data available to someone in North America and vice versa, right? So when you start designing applications that offer horizontal capability, you need to offer that vertical data fragmentation. It's very, very important that you do that. So starting with your core capabilities, you need to ensure that your core capabilities contain the structure, standards, and policy framework that are required for AI, compliance and architecture. The second is then you create a common capabilities layer where you start to catalog all reusable libraries and components that you could potentially would be required for almost most of your LLM applications. So for example, things like web scraping capability, so on and so forth, right? APIs, we'll discuss that in more detail. And then finally, you keep distinct features and capabilities that are required by individual business units and capability areas. So what typically tends to happen is when you start designing your core capability, you need to ensure that they are funded and sourced via a centralized architecture authority. They are essentially designed by the architects who are aware of the regulatory compliance, and they provide that thin layer of the blueprints, architectural blueprints that are compliant policy and documentation, so on and so forth. Essentially a framework of sorts, right? We are talking about a framework of sorts. Then common capabilities could be co-sponsored. So for example, 2 or more people are running on a same use case, which requires a common capability. You could basically split the budget to co-sponsor that capability and build that team that way. So this is a larger diagram of that common capability layer model. What we've done is we've essentially sort of thought about what those capability areas could be for the enterprise. When you talk about core capabilities, the key capability is obviously the access management, activity monitoring, policy management, configuration, fine-tuning. Common capabilities, as I talked about, web scraping, your ODS, your workflow orchestration capability, so on and so forth. There can be others. I've just given some sample. This is by no means an exhaustive list. And then you would have a distinct capabilities of database schema. And that entire architecture stack could be exposed in 2 modalities. The first modality is a model in a service modality, where you have a very specifically defined LLM which caters to a certain task, right? In this case, probably a co-pilot, right? So you may choose to get a vendor tool for that, but you may also choose to define your own or use your own. But that's just one of the sort of thing. You can have your own AI assistants which is tuned for a certain task. And then the other category is model as a service. Now, model as a service for your enterprise could be an at abstraction level of offering that model as a service, and there could be n number of systems hooking into that model for data and input, right? And then you can ornament that entire thing, or you can essentially complement that with federated code repositories across the different capability layers. Of course, with common code guidelines and structures. You could have documentation and blueprints. You could have IAC across each layer so that it becomes easier for them to build that capability quickly. And there should be obviously a very strong process to use case intake. So for initial use case, you need to make sure that the ground level components are built to begin with. So now on the topic of AI regulation, which seems to be my favorite topic, I kept talking about it all throughout the discussion. So obviously there's a lot of progress in my home country, UK. We've had an AI safety summit that happened in last year in December. Mr. Rishi Sunak invited all the world leaders to sign the AI safety summit. Interestingly, China and everybody were the co-signatory to that. There's a lot of movement happening. USA has published an IST 601, Saudi Arabia, Singapore. I've not used all the countries that have started to collaborate on all of these together so far. Just some random sample of countries. Probably not fully random. I was in Dubai last week, so I've used that example here. The good thing about regulatory framework is there's a lot of collaboration that's happening in this space, right? So there's a AI safety summit that I talked about that happened where a number of countries are signatory. There is a Hiroshima process. There is a EU process. So there are people who are coming together in different groups, and they are almost all of them are agreeing on common principles and practices of designing responsible AI, which is the good news for us, because as enterprises, we don't want them to all call out different things, because then for multinational organizations, it becomes that much more challenging to create a regulatory framework around it, right? So what are those common framework or principles to which the countries are agreeing to? So fairness, ethics, transparency, accountability, data privacy, and human oversight. These are some of the common principles that we've seen across the globe that people are agreeing to, right? So it becomes that much more easy for us to then start building our policy framework and structures in place alongside those pillars of trust, transparency, and fairness. So what does a entire end-to-end flow of governance looks like if you were to consider these particular components? So if you talk about this, this is the example of a particular governance framework. So if you are a multinational organization which operates across 90 countries, how would you define your regulatory remit, right? So you're talking about a M by N dimension of your regulatory regime. So what's the first parameter of that M by N? The M is basically the regions across which, or the legal entities that you are operating. The second dimension is the different technologies that get involved. So for example, when you talk about AI, you don't only have to comply with EU AI Act, you also have to comply with GDPR, right? So all those GDPR and data protection laws, they also come into play. So you need to look at the EU AI Act. For example, someone operating in EU, you'll have to consider GDPR, and that makes up your M by N matrix of your regulatory compliance universe. So you look at your entire regulatory compliance universe, then you start understanding what are my current standards, policies, and controls. What is the delta between what's ought to happen and what's happening, and then you start doing a maturity assessment of your existing regulatory process, start to amend, create new controls, create new standards and policies and principles in place, and then start to essentially document all of them, create a body, a governing body, a AI steerco, which then sets up a operating model, roles and responsibilities, ways of working to start to enact and bring that forward. And then you need to look at your entire life cycle of delivering that model from POC to production and understand what are the processes that I need to instrument in order to get the data and policy related controls that needs to be applied across the life cycle. So right from use case definition, design, validation, deployment and operation, what sort of tooling. And you do that through the tooling that's required across the board. So people, process, and technology. Essentially, you need to create a new operating model for AI governance within your enterprise is how you will have to essentially do this, right? So with that, I'll conclude. Essentially, when you talk about the 3 user groups within the enterprise or 3 adoption groups, the things that they need to do, starting, if you were to take from the top, you need to create a comprehensive AI and data strategy. You need to ensure that you are enabling your talent to prepare for that AI revolution. You need to ensure that your entire use case definition and taking it to production process is very structured, disciplined, and business case driven. You need to ensure that your data quality is top notch. And you need to then put in place a governance structure, an operating model across AI to ensure that that then enacts your function. And you need to make sure that you have a scalable AI platform that allows you to scale AI across the enterprise, but in a way that's compliant with policy and governance framework. And ultimately, you need to start looking at the testing of your AI models, because very, very important. There's something called as non-deterministic nature of AI. There's a model drift that happens. So you need to constantly keep testing the models that have been put in place. And finally, you need to foster a culture of innovation and continuous learning. That's it from my side. Thank you, everyone.